Okay, let's unpack this. Today, we're diving deep into a country often described as, well, a land of profound paradoxes. Côte d'Ivoire. I mean, think about it, a nation that has battled through intense political instability, civil wars, deep internal divisions since independence, yet somehow it remains an economic powerhouse, a real shining star in West Africa. How does that even happen? And, what does it mean for its people, its culture, its future?
That's the core question, isn't it? Our sources for this deep dive, they paint a really fascinating, often turbulent picture. We've compiled insights from historical academic papers detailing its pre-colonial past, the nuances of French colonization, and we've also got analyses of its political upheavals, economic policies, and importantly, its vibrant cultural expressions. Our mission today really is to extract those crucial nuggets of knowledge, those aha moments that help us truly understand the unique trajectory of Côte d'Ivoire, a country that, despite all the turmoil, is the world's largest exporter of cocoa beans and coffee, and the third largest producer of palm oil. It's just a compelling story of resilience that, as you'll see, is kind of etched into its very identity.
Right, okay. So here's where it gets really interesting for me. Before the French really settled in, what did our sources tell us about the pre-colonial landscape? Like, what was life like on the ground? Particularly those indigenous power structures and their early interactions.
Well, the sources describe thriving tribal groups, especially the Akan people. They really dominated coastal trade networks back in the 19th century. Think bustling port cities like Assini, Grand-Bassam, Abidjan. They were actively, forging alliances, waging wars, expanding their reach. What's fascinating here, though, is how quickly that European interaction shifted. It wasn't just simple trade for long. I mean, sure, initial contacts go way back to the 15th century, looking for ivory, gold dust, the usual riches. But French pioneers from Senegal only really started making treaties with Akan chiefs in the 1840s, specifically to open up more direct trade.
And it wasn't just about simple merchants trying to trade pine, was it? You're saying the French quickly seized more actual control?
Exactly. The French moved pretty quickly from trade to, well, direct control, buying valuable tusks from traders who, and this is shocking, were often enslaved. Enslaved by both the Akan themselves and other groups like the Ashanti and Fonte. So the colonial ambition was clear pretty early on. But here's something genuinely surprising from the sources. Despite setting up a firm foothold in coastal areas like Grand-Bassam, the French seemed largely uninterested in inland affairs, at least until the mid-1880s.
Uninterested. Why?
Well, primarily because the various Akan states in the interior were caught up in this catastrophic civil war. It left behind apparently nothing but ruins, which ironically is what prompted the French to finally complete their conquest of the coast by 1893.
That resistance, or maybe just the internal chaos, sounds formidable. So even after securing the coast, what was it specifically about the Ivorian interior? What made it so challenging for the French to penetrate for so long? The sources mention natural barriers, organized resistance.
You're absolutely right. The interior was incredibly tough terrain. Even after pacifying the coast by 1896, the French ran into dense rainforest. And not just forest, but well-organized Akan, Kru, and Mamde states. They weren't just walking in. You had Governor Yves Thibault and Dr. Louis-Gustave Binger undertaking this year-long reconnaissance mission just to map the place and establish relations. They specifically noted how incredibly remote areas like the Como Basin were from the nearest railhead. It was disconnected. And for almost a century and a half, even though they were active elsewhere in West Africa, the French really struggled to find access routes into the Ivorian hinterland. Why? Because the Ivorians, deeply dubious of colonial intentions, resolutely barred the coastal passage to the interior. That's a direct quote. It's almost like the country itself was putting up its own defense, both natural and social. Leading to this period, the French called one of solitude and forgetfulness.
Wow, solitude and forgetfulness. That really highlights the Ivorian resistance from the get-go. So what happens when the French finally decide to resume their efforts? The sources suggest their early colonial administration was clumsy, marked by blunders.
Oh, definitely. They saw the Ivorian coast as strategically vital, yeah, calling it the most beautiful and safe anchorage of West Africa, setting up bases like Grand-Bassam and Assini. Yet their early administration was riddled with blunders. Big ones. In a move described as being driven by, quote, greed and pusillanimity, the French initially just offloaded the responsibility of governing this distant colony. They gave it to a commercial company in 1881.
A private company running a colony. That sounds like a recipe for disaster.
It pretty much was. The decision ultimately ruined the governor general, according to one source, and it led to violent agitation, even deaths among the white colonists themselves. It turned Côte d'Ivoire into a, quote, land of horror by 1892.
A land of horror. Good grief. That's a chaotic and frankly bloody start. It makes you wonder about the perception on the ground, if even their own people were dying. How did these blunders and the wider colonial practices the sources mention, illicit loot, abnormal mortality, how did that fuel the later demands for independence?
Well, those early blunders certainly set a tone of deep discontent, absolutely. And this was just aggravated further by the Great War. It led to a widespread refusal to obey colonial laws. By 1926, you see a direct and growing demand for independence from France. The sources point to things like illicit loot and premeditated colonization found in payment records, essentially widespread corruption, land grabs. And alongside that, abnormal mortality among infants during this really stormy period. These weren't minor issues. They painted a picture of deep, long-standing illnesses, systemic exploitation. That fundamentally fueled the independence movement. Experiencing it as a land of horror left an indelible mark.
Okay, so that brings us eventually to independence in 1960, and to this really central figure, Félix Houphouët-Boigny, often called the father of independent Côte d'Ivoire. He governed for an incredible 33 years, until his death in 93. The sources describe him in these paradoxical terms, deeply rooted in philanthropy and foreignness, even the father of the poor. What's the key insight there? How did he manage stability for so long with what sound like, well, contradictory approaches?
Yeah, it's fascinating. It's truly insightful, I think, is understanding that Côte d'Ivoire's early stability wasn't really built on strong democratic institutions, not primarily. It was built on this leader's unique personal network and a very, very strategic distribution of wealth. This kind of patronage stability, as the sources imply, was rooted in his ability to be seen as both, like you said, a benevolent fund and a very shrewd politician. Take the foreign workforce, for example. He saw them as an asset in large-scale economic development. He annually welcomed dependent foreigners. One source called it savvy public relations.
Savvy public relations, so a blend of genuine outreach, maybe, and shrewd political maneuvering. He even dreamed of a peasantry of plantation owners, right? Encouraging large foreign landowners from Cameroon and Senegal to serve as models. But it wasn't all-inclusive development, was it? By mid-1963, political pluralism was basically over. The radical left was annihilated, embedded. How did Houphouët-Boigny use his wiliness, as the sources put it, to consolidate power and ensure stability, even if it meant strong-arm tactics?
Precisely. His wiliness led him to deploy all sorts of tactics, diplomatic, militaristic, mediatory, whatever, work to smooth over political problems. So while he might have had this vision for an inclusive Côte d'Ivoire, the reality of holding on to power was different. The sources mention a witch hunting of disaffected social classes, even peasants in Abidjan. And his administration worked hard to pacify its erstwhile opponents. How? By sending these embourgeoisified bureaucrats and chiefs out to the countryside. They were called agents de redéveloppement, basically local facilitators given money to encourage economic reinvestment, but also to subtly co-opt former opponents, keep them in the fold.
So stability, but definitely enforced stability, with a firm hand.
Undeniably, loyalty was directly tied to getting senior political positions, and national revenues, mostly from cocoa and coffee, were strategically distributed. This largely favored the southern cocoa growing zones with infrastructure development, while the north received development too, but more at sort of regional averages. Not the same focus. This created immediate economic buoyancy, yes, but it also inherently sowed these deep seeds of regional and ethnic inequality, seeds that would inevitably sprout once that strong, centralized authority was gone.
And that stability, built on these personal arrangements and strategic distribution, not robust institutions, it couldn't last forever. After Houphouët-Boigny's death, what kind of political unraveling did the country experience? The sources describe a rapid succession of leaders in the 90s, early 2000s, a revolving door of power through coups.
It was a really sharp decline, yeah. Multiple political parties emerged, often tied strongly to specific regional and ethnic groups, and this led to extreme instability. You saw figures like General Robert Gay overthrowing Vice President Henri Konan Bédier in '93, only for Bédier himself to be returned by a counter-coup just 14 months later. The country, which had been seen as this beacon of stability, became increasingly divided, clearly along north-south lines by 2002. It was a really turbulent period. Power struggles, fragmentations.
And right at the heart of this escalating tension, you have Laurent Gbagbo. He comes to power using what the sources call street activism, reminiscent of Hugo Chávez's tactics. A populist approach, presenting himself as a man of the people, championing the rural poor against his perceived foreign oppressor. And this fueled that potent and ultimately destructive ideology, Ivoirité, or Ivorianness. Could you explain how this concept, which sounds nationalistic on the surface, became such a divisive force, leading directly to civil conflict?
Yeah, Ivory was powerful, no doubt, but deeply divisive. It tapped into what the sources call colonially inspired notions of belonging, and also 2 decades of fears of so-called Ghanaian invaders, old anxieties being repurposed. On July 9, 2000, Agebe himself apparently ascribed this notion of belonging as his most feared strategy of war. His words. Essentially, it sought to define who was truly Ivorian and who wasn't. And this often targeted people from the north, or foreign workers, many of whom had actually been welcomed under Houphouët-Boigny, ironically. This exclusion, combined with Gbagbo's attempts to consolidate what sources call unwarranted legitimacy and shut out the opposition, it directly contributed to the first civil conflict and eventually a second civil war.
So this seemingly nationalistic idea was weaponized, contributing to a complete breakdown of order. The conflict even spilled into Liberia. The sources mention rebel-backed politicians taking power in a Mogadishu-like condition, chaos. And Gbagbo ends up at the International Criminal Court in The Hague, like a Milosevic-type trial. That paints a picture of extreme crisis, international intervention. What was the immediate aftermath like once Alassane Ouattara was finally declared the winner in April 2011?
Well, it was a brutal period of transition, according to the reports. The sources describe victorious troops killing Gbagbo supporters and a process of retribution taking place. It really highlights the deep wounds, the cycles of violence that this kind of divisive ideology and protracted conflict leave behind. Sending Gbagbo to the ICC was obviously a significant moment, an attempt at international justice. But the internal healing process, that remained, and you could argue still remains, incredibly complex.
Yet despite all this political upheaval, these civil conflicts, Côte d'Ivoire's economic engine, mainly agriculture, just kept churning. It's still the world's largest exporter of cocoa, coffee, cashew nuts. But that growth, it hasn't been without costs, right? What are some of the enduring challenges, the paradoxes tied to this economic success?
Indeed. The engine kept running, but not without consequences. The sources note, for instance, that opening roads for development needed for trade also led to significant deforestation and the intensification of farming. Bananas, coffee, cocoa, big plantations. There's also this really nuanced point that for many coastal people, there was no golden age in this development. They faced too many surprises with the seedlings bought without their knowledge and found oil palm exploitation unprofitable. So development wasn't always beneficial or equitable for everyone on the ground, and you still have these glaringly high socioeconomic disparities today, plus a resurgence of rural violence tied back to internal migration patterns that started way back in the 1980s. These are still critical issues that just, well, economic growth alone hasn't fixed.
And a really significant challenge, but also maybe a huge opportunity facing the country now, is youth unemployment. The population is incredibly young. Over 79% under 35. That's an incredible demographic dividend, potentially. But it's also a major risk, isn't it? If these young people don't have access to education, training, decent jobs, what are the sources saying about that?
They highlight exactly that tension. While the government has made efforts since 2011 setting up things like the National Employment Agency, the Ivorian Office for Youth Employment, focusing on things like apprenticeship-based training, the challenge is still massive. Even with overall economic growth, peasant unemployment remains high. And you have relatively low official unemployment rates, but large proportions of what's called disguised unemployment and just generally unskilled jobs.
Disguised unemployment.
Yeah.
What does that mean exactly?
It means people might technically be employed, maybe working a few hours here and there, or in jobs that don't fully use their skills or don't contribute much productively. It sort of masks a deeper lack of good, productive, fulfilling jobs. So it's a really complex issue where headline growth doesn't always translate into widespread opportunity, especially for the youth.
Right. Yet amidst all these challenges, the sources consistently describe Côte d'Ivoire as being incredibly rich and resilient culturally. The fact that its forest regions were inaccessible until the 70s actually helped protect some cultural and environmental heritage. How do these cultural expressions, these traditions, embody the country's enduring spirit? How do they act as a vital force despite all the turmoil?
Oh, absolutely. It's a huge testament to the nation's profound identity, its core strength. The country is described as a monument of invention and appropriation of techniques. They adapt, they create, take language and literature, influenced by the Latin alphabet from the colonizers, sure. But they also boast pre-colonial manuscripts that somehow escaped that colonial linguistic imposition, showing these deep roots to its own past.
And the music. The sources just light up describing the vibrant blend of popular and traditional styles. You've got Zouglou, emerging from Abidjan's youth in the early 90s, tackling social ills head-on. Mapuka, the dance of the women. Soukous, influenced by Congolese music, which is huge across Africa. And, of course, the really popular Cooper Décalé. Plus traditional dances like Kunun and Kodakalu, rooted deep in mythology, playing crucial roles in cultural life, rites of passage.
Exactly. These artistic expressions, they aren't just entertainment. They've been a vital outlet for social commentary, yes, but also just a way for people to process the turmoil, to connect. They're a powerful unifying force that really embodies Côte d'Ivoire's resilience, its enduring identity, despite all the challenges thrown its way.
So, wrapping this up, what does this all mean for you, our listener? Côte d'Ivoire clearly emerges as a nation defined by this incredible resilience, these profound paradoxes, and this ongoing quest to reconcile its rich cultural traditions with economic modernity and, crucially, political stability.
Yeah, from those pre-colonial Akan kingdoms, through the complex legacy of Houphouët-Boigny, and through the incredibly turbulent civil conflicts, and now the ongoing efforts for reconciliation and economic development, it's a country that is constantly forging its identity.
It's a story that really shows how historical foundations, those colonial experiences, leadership choices, good and bad, how they ripple through generations, how they shape a nation's present and its future. So here's something to think about. Given Côte d'Ivoire's phenomenal agricultural powerhouse status, cocoa, coffee, cashews, and its incredibly young population, what unique path could it possibly forge to finally overcome these damaging cycles of political instability, to fully realize its immense potential, and maybe, just maybe, offer some powerful lessons to other nations grappling with similar post-colonial identities, managing their own resource wealth in a way that truly benefits everyone? That's something to mull over long after this deep dive is over.